This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Hello, I'm Hanif Baharuddin. You're tuned into the show that brings you closer to the people and places of our capital city. In this episode, we're going to learn a bit more about mosques and suraus and how they can be designed in a more practical way to accommodate users more comfortably. Joining me to talk about it is Ali Sabrina Ismail. She's the Director of Architecture from the Faculty of Built Environment and Surveying, University Technology Malaysia. She's going to start by breaking down the many architectural styles that are adopted by the many mosques in the country.
Okay, thank you so much, Hanif. All right, if we look into the context of Malaysia, and Malaysia has actually undergone a lot of evolution in terms of mosque architecture development, and there's a lot of scholars have done a lot of documentation about mosque evolution and mosque development in Malaysia, and most of scholars actually had outlined there are 7 styles of mosque architectural language that actually can be classified in the Malaysian context itself, and these are the traditional vernacular, and then you have the Sino-eclectic, the colonial or the European classicism, and then you have the North Indian style and the modern vernacular, the modernistic expressionism, and the postmodern revivalism. So I think perhaps for the betterment for the audience, I think I'll explain each of these styles in a very brief manner so that you can understand what is the differences between these 7 styles. So if you look at the first one, which is the vernacular style architecture, which is the traditional vernacular. So if you understand the word vernacular itself, it actually means denoting to the availability of the materials, the craftsmanship, the technology of the pre-colonial period. So there are 3 types of mosque which falls in this category, which actually can be distinguished mainly from the use of the roof form itself. So the first one is the 3-tiered pyramidal roof form, which is the example like the Kampung Laut or the Kampung Tuan Masjid, and it was believed to be built between the 16th and the 17th century. And then we have the second type, which is the 2-tiered pyramidal roof form, which is the Papan and Lenggeng Mosque, and then this mosque actually was built in the 18th and the 19th century. And the third kind is the gable roof form, which is similar to that of the house kind of a shape, but all of these mosques is actually made of timber, that's why they fall in the category of the traditional vernacular. But then we have this Sino-eclectic architectural mosque style. But the Sino-eclectic mosque style actually indicates a lot of Chinese influence to it. And it has this eclectic style because it denotes a combination of 2 or more kind of influence of architectural language. And the most popular mosques of this style you can see is the Kampung Hulu Mosque, the Tengkera Mosque, which are all located in Malacca. And the most significant features of this mosque is that they are surrounded by a masonry fence, and they most like reminiscence like the Chinese temples. And then the third one, we have the European classicism, or known as the colonial style, and which actually refers a lot to the high Renaissance kind of architecture that was derived from the Greco-Roman heritage. And such example, you can see this one is the Sultan Abu Bakar Mosque in Johor, which actually shows a lot of features and characteristics using columns, using a tripartite division of base, middle, and top with double columns supporting with semicircular kind of an arches. So it more look like a colonial kind of an architectural features. And then we have this North Indian style. So this North Indian styles, one of the good example is mentioned just now by you, Hanif, is the Jamek Mosque, and the Masjid India Mosque, which is in Kuala Lumpur, and which has a lot of use of small and large onion domes, and they have this multitude of spires and canopies, and have more than one minaret, and using a lot of horseshoe kind of an arches to it. But then in the 19 and the late 19 and the early 20th century, we have this modernistic kind of a style of mosque that comes to place in Malaysia. So this kind of modernistic actually rejects a lot of ornamentation in any of the form. So they much look into the abstraction of form that celebrates the structural expression in architecture. So the good one example is the National Mosque, which was built by Datuk Baharuddin, and then we have the Negeri Sembilan State Mosque. So most of them are using this kind of a modern materials, like the National Mosque. They use this folded plate dome with a metaphor like a royal umbrella, signifying the importance of the building like a national monument. So, and then we have the latest stage, which is the postmodernist revivalism. So, the postmodernist revivalism actually happens in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. And we have these two categories within this realm, which is the first one is the foreign revivalism and the vernacular revivalism. The foreign revivalism is much actually focusing on using Iranian and Turkish domes, like Egyptian, Turkish minarets, Persian Iwan gateways. And this is actually, you can see in the Putra Mosque located in Putrajaya, and then we have the Shah Alam State Mosque. But then the vernacular revivalism also, there's another touch to it, but it shows the construction without using any Middle Eastern kind of a flavor, but more towards the Central Asian touches. So such priority or example of this mosque is the Malacca State Mosque located in Malacca. So in overall, there are seven important dominant styles of mosque architecture in Malaysia. Yeah.
All right. So there are different varieties of I guess moss there that you mentioned earlier, but they all tend to I guess gravitate towards a design that can be considered classically a mosque. If you know what I mean, with a minaret and also dome, perhaps, right? But like, are there any attempts at trying to I guess move away from having these symbols for our mosque? Is that even like something that people have started to think about?
Yes, actually, there is, because if you look into the late 21st century, there is a different kind of an approach towards mosque design, and this one you can see a lot, like the example of the Masjid Fi Sabilillah. So inside Berjaya, so this Masjid Fi Sabilillah was designed by the architects of Atsa Sendirian Berhad, and the main approach of the design of this mosque is actually looking into sustainability in concept. So the mosque actually use a more simpler kind of a minimalist kind of a form rather than adopting the dome design, with tall minarets similar to the Middle Eastern kind of features. But this mosque actually gives more approach and more sensitivity towards providing a sustainable kind of an environment for the user. So they provide a lot of natural air circulation, comfort, and then you can see there's a lot of using geometric carvings that abstracting from the lettering of the cut calligraphy, but more into a known as a modernistic and kind of a minimalist kind of an expression. So Masjid Negara also have this kind of design to it. It doesn't use the onion dome or using the dome structure as itself, but it uses the combination of modernistic reinterpretation of a traditional Malay architecture with a folded plate to symbolize the idea of the dome. And Masjid Negara also uses the implementation of this traditional kind of a Malay architecture, like the Malay house, where they have where the Masjid Negara has extensive set of serambi, have a veranda space with a lot of light courts and air wells. So this, in one sense, provide a lot of ample of daylighting and passive cooling to the building. So this not only bring out the technological qualities of the architecture of the mosque, but also it imbued and brings back the idea of the spiritual qualities to the design. And at the same time, it gives a lot of comfort to the users by having this kind of a natural environment to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? I think you mentioned sustainability at one point just now, and I think that's something that we can talk about after this as well. But essentially, that's the main question, right? Can we juggle between mosque designs and architecture that are beautiful and also practical, and can they both coexist?
Yes, actually, yes, because the keyword here is balance. When you talk about balance here, meaning that whatever building that you design, whether it is a religious building or as a public institution, the keyword is that you need to adopt a kind of a democratic kind of an architecture approach. So, in this sense, a designer should always think that whenever you build a building, the built form should actually have a sense of a holistic experience and quality. So, in this sense, it needs to be capable of fulfilling the comfort needs of the society at all levels, which means talking about the community individuals consisting of anything that they feel or they think. So, in this sense, for a built form to portray the idea of democracy, it actually need to emphasize on the two main design aspects involving the form and the spatial organization, because these two elements actually need to promote the idea of spirit of time and spirit of place. So perhaps I need to elaborate a little bit actually, Hanif, what is actually spirit of time and spirit of place for the audience to understand. Okay. So if we talk about spirit of time here, which means that you need to talk about a building, that a building should appear to be functional to fulfill the need of the user in all aspects, but also at the same time it need to be aesthetically pleasing in style. So, in this sense, we need to produce a design that actually can assert the usage of energy saving features, and second, to portray a form that can adapt the use of the natural materials. And the third is to implement a non excessive embellishment and ornamentation. There's nothing wrong to have ornamentation and embellishment, but the embellishment and the ornamentation has to have function to it, which means that it has to be treated as a functional entity and need to be well integrated with the whole structural form. For instance, I'm taking example, if you putting a lot of columns, for instance, the main body of the column is actually to support the building structure, but at the same time the column that you use can actually adorn and give some sort like a decoration aesthetically pleasing to the whole concept of the building form. And if you look into the fourth thing is that you need also to have the awareness towards the idea of transparency. So in this sense, you must have a building design that actually based on the idea of the concept of a community, where in which the built form can integrate it into the communities they intended to serve, and it must have a better function to it, a best function that can serve back to the community. So this is where the idea of the spirit of time and spirit of place comes to place. So when we talk about spirit of time, the building also has to be within the bounding of the locality itself, which means it has to respond to the existing climate, respond to the existing topography, and also respond to the existing culture of the people. And when I talk about the spirit of time, which means that the building also has to be within the identity, within the contemporary context, so that the building can be easily accepted by the people and also by the user.
That was Ali Sabrina Ismail, Director of Architecture from the Faculty of Built Environment and Surveying, University Technology Malaysia, sharing her knowledge on mosque architecture. We're going for a short break. Stay tuned. I'm Hanif Baharuddin and you're listening to I Love KL on BFM 89.9. BFM 89.9, you're listening to I Love KL, bringing you closer to the people and places of our capital city. I'm Hanif Baharuddin. I'm joined by Ali Sabrina Ismail. She's the Director of Architecture from the Faculty of Built Environment and Surveying, University Technology Malaysia, and we're currently talking about mosque architecture and design. We're going to continue the conversation now by looking at how practical mosque architecture should be defined.
Okay, that's a good question actually, because the first thing is that you have to understand the main concept in designing a mosque. Okay, because most of people will always think that whenever you design a mosque, like a religious institution, it is actually talking about more towards denoting towards this idea of the building like some sort like an object, some sort like a house of worship. But if you're looking into another concept of understanding the historical development behind how does mosque comes into place since the time of the Prophet Muhammad, a mosque is actually a place where you call it as a place where the community gathers for the development and the benefit of the community. So in this sense, but as time goes along, mosques become like a monumental kind of a structure that symbolizes the idea of a politics, economy, and things like that. So the real definition or the real essence or the spiritual being of the mosque, being a community center, is actually slowly become erode in the society. So they think it as a mosque like an aesthetic object, like a object, like a house of worship, something sacred and things like that. But if you really understand the idea of the mosque that is being put forth by the Prophet Muhammad, like the Masjid Nabawi in Medina and things like that, that is where the idea of interaction comes into place. So the concept of designing mosques actually falls into three categories, which means that the first one is talking about producing a mosque that can actually integrate the movement of the community and also the environment. So this one actually you can achieve through by having the mosque that practices a kind of a design, a concept of openness and fully functions in a local context. So in this sense, the mosque is open to all, whether you are a Muslim or a non-Muslim, to come and use the function of the mosque. And second, when we talk about the mosque design, is that using the natural building materials, because when you apply the nature of the humanity and respect for the nature for the building design, it is not only sustainable and environmental friendly, but it also talk about producing a responsible kind of an architecture that actually purifies the need for the senses, that responds to the human will. And in this sense, it relates back to organic kind of an approach. And the third one is when we talk about producing a mosque design, it also need to relate back to this idea and the needs of the local culture. So the mosque that in Malaysia, located in Malaysia, might be in a different context if the mosque is located in the non-Muslim country, like in the States or maybe in other parts of the world. So in this sense, the identity also plays an important role. So like if for the mosque to be located in Malaysia, I think that we need to bring out the local culture, the local climate, and the local needs of the people. So this is actually relate back to the Islamic principles. So when we design a mosque, I think Islamic principles also need to come into place. When we talk about this word like ikram, islah, and also insan. Because if you talk about the word, the principles of Islam, like ikram, ikram means you are trying to implement the nature of human congregation, to strengthen the connections between people. So in this sense, the mosque must portray the idea of a placemaking concept. And when we talk about Islah, the principle of Islam, like Islah means like applying the specific manners of adab, custom according to the Quran and Sunnah in the mosque design. So in this sense, when we produce a mosque design, it has to have the concept of orderly and functional in terms of the space making, with a kind of appropriate hierarchy and spatial arrangements that actually, perhaps, for instance, safeguard the aura and the privacy between the men and women. So as an example. And also if we talk about the idea of ihsan, the principles of ihsan. Ihsan here means like creating a religious atmosphere through the charity of mosque, like emulating back the Nabawi mosque concept during the days of the Prophet. So in this sense, when we talk about ihsan, the mosque must indicate the sense of genius loci, the sense of place, and have the idea of openness in terms of its location, placement, and is accessible to all, which means that it not only respond to the local climate and landscape, but it also open to non-Muslim and to Muslim to join together to be in the mosque and to learn more and to get to know closer to Islam. Yeah, I think that's the most important thing if you understand the real concept of mosque architecture and design.
All right. Okay, that's nice. Okay, if you don't mind, let's explore designs that we can perhaps apply when it comes to thinking about, certain sections of the mosque, right? For example, prayer hall. I'm quite also interested in exploring the ablution area and how perhaps we can design it better to accommodate how it's being used on a daily basis, right? Because sometimes, if you go to a mosque these days, there is a lack of cohesion when it comes to designing the ablution area and also the prayer hall, resulting in sometimes the ablution area can be a bit, water can clog up easily. And then for people who have just taken their ablution, as they walk towards the prayer hall, sometimes, they have to also consider, drying their feet and things like that. So how can we start thinking about a more, quote unquote, progressive design that can be more comfortable, can be made more comfortable for end users?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point, Hanif. Okay, because when you talk about mosque design, it is actually a public place, where people come and go, and sometimes you have a mosque that is open 24 hours a day and function throughout the day or and daily. So which means you have those five prayers that you have to do. So it's a kind of a daily place that people come and go, and in a very large congregation. So in this sense, there are three aspects of a design parameters that actually we should understand when going to design a mosque. So number one is about the design features itself. So when I talk about these design features, it's actually involve the spatial layout of the mosque, the orientation, and the segregation between the male and female within the mosque area. And then we also talk about the material and the structural finishes of the mosque design. So another design aspects that we also need to look into is the supporting facilities. And you are right, Hanif, you're mentioning about the ablution treatment. Yeah, that is actually the most significant area in a mosque design. And not only that, we will need to talk about comfort of the user also. And this involve ventilation, hygiene, and privacy. And then we also have the third one, which is the design aspects, which is the accessories provision. So this one may be in terms of the decorative elements and the interior accessories. So if I want to explain all of the design features and how the design parameters should look like, it will take long, but I will just pick up the most important thing. So when we design a mosque, it is very, very crucial that talking about user comfort, because when you talk about user comfort, it's actually not only increase the spirituality within the congregation itself or within individuals, but it also can increase the quality of our ibadah, how we do it, the salat and things like that when we are in the mosque. So the design treatments of the supporting facilities is very important. When you talk about noise, order, you talk about ventilation, thermal comfort, lightings, and things like that. So in this sense, I just pick up one and two to explain. So the most important thing is, for instance, ventilation treatment. So ventilation treatment is very important for prayer spaces. So when you have a prayer spaces, especially like you're doing Tarawih, during Ramadan, there's a big congregation at one time. So you need to have a very well ventilated space to ensure there's a lot of air movement within the space. But nowadays, most of the designers try to avoid using natural ventilation, and they just put air conditioning system, mechanical ventilation. And at that time, when you have carpet, as to cover the flooring system in most of the mosque, it will actually gives order to it, and some sort like a not nice smell within the prayer hall. So in this sense, it is very critical and very crucial for architect to think what is the best material. How do we actually design a prayer space that actually can have a lot of natural cross ventilation and actually can give a nice thermal comfort when the user perform their salat or ibadah. So in this sense, perhaps you can use a lot of open air kind of design for the prayer hall. You can have large openings, using a lot of auxiliary fan to give an effect like a cross ventilation within the prayer space hall. So this is very important also, because when you talk about prayer space hall, not only on ventilation also, Hanif, you're talking about how do you segregate, the privacy treatment also between space provision between male and female. But at the same time, you want also the woman to have gender equity within the mosque design itself. Okay, so this is critical when you design the hierarchy of the spaces. So that's why it goes back to the Islamic principle when I mentioned about the word ikram, or the word ihsan. When you talk about ikram and ihsan, the principle of Islam, and you really understand that, then the designer can design a better space within the mosque area itself.
Okay, we've been focusing a lot on mosques, but I'm also quite interested in suraus, and not just the smaller standalone suraus that we see in our neighborhood, but also public suraus. For example, in public spaces like malls, right? For example, I think these days, to be fair, a lot of malls have made quite an effort to make sure that our public suraus are quite accommodative and quite comfortable for people to use. But it's always interesting to think about how it can perhaps be designed better, especially in a limited space, right? Considering that, again, these places can be used, there can be quite a high traffic when it comes to prayer times, right? So how do we go about thinking about, I guess, designing a surau, essentially as just a small prayer space for people to use during prayer times, in a quote unquote limited space, like for example in malls.
Yeah, okay. To understand first, if we look into the term surau, surau is also a place to perform prayer, right? But usually the surau, the minimum size for a surau usually within a 20 square meters. That is the basic area for you to conduct your prayer within that area of surau. um, Even though that surau also has the same function as the mosque, but mosque is the bigger version, surau is a smaller version, and surau is where you perform the salat and things like that, and but within a short or duration or temporary duration of time, because sometimes you have to do other things, you just perform very quickly and then you move on and do all your daily necessities. But when you talk about surau design also has to be very practical. It also have to have a proper design features, the best supporting facilities, and also the accessories provision required to do the liturgical requirements of a salat. So it's similar like the design parameters like I mentioned previously. When you design the mosque, you have to look into the design aspects of its design features, the supporting facilities, and also the accessories provision. But when you talk about the surau itself, what is the most critical part is actually the spatial orientation towards the qibla. Because sometimes when surau is located, for instance, in mall, in petrol station, um, the problem is that the space that you have is very limited, and then at the same time you couldn't have the very specific space that is actually oriented towards the qibla, and sometimes it is tilted here and there, and it doesn't have the real accuracy of the space layout. So at the end, perhaps the spatial orientation can create some sort like a wasted of space and also inefficiency in terms of the floor plan, just to cater for the self alignment in the surau itself. So in this sense, when you talk about designing a surau, usually the designers of the architect have an what you call that, they put the thought of designing a surau later rather than embed the design of a surau during the process of the design. This is usually what we call putting in the surau spaces with after the design of the building is completed. Okay, so this is where the problem comes in. So but if the design of the surau actually comes firsthand, in parallel, when the architect comes up with a program brief and the ideation and embed it together, I think there's no problem in terms of talking about the orientation of the surau might be not enough or things like that to cater for the self alignment, and also how to orientate the space perpendicular to the qibla axis and things like that. So this is where it comes firsthand that the designer has to think first on the location of the surau in each of the public spaces that they designed. So if this process comes into being, then I think the problem of the planning of the surau won't be a big issue after all. But this is known as afterthought design. Then actually it gives an impact to the design of the surau.
Did the pandemic have any effect on the thinking behind how our mosques and suraus should be designed better in the future?
Yes, definitely, Hanif. Okay, because remember during the pandemic COVID, and I think that's we are not allowed to go to the mosque, to pray, and especially like Tarawih during Ramadan 2 years ago, most of us are doing our own prayer at home. So this is very crucial, because when we talk about mosque design in Malaysia, most of mosque design in Malaysia are actually enclosed spaces, and they have four walls, and at the end of the day they have to put mechanical ventilation to it just to air within the spaces. So but when pandemic hits, the design of the mosque actually start to evolve. When you have this pandemic, it's actually a blessing in disguise, because designers start to think about ventilation, natural cross ventilation, and how to maintain a healthy indoor kind of an air quality to it, rather than using mechanical ventilation. So mosque actually evolve. I think in the late after the pandemic COVID hits, there's a lot of new mosque coming into Malaysia design, and one example is the Dying Mosque. The Dying Mosque, but it is located in Johor, and uses most of it are all open, and uses natural ventilation and natural air to it. So I believe that this actually gives a lot of consideration towards the physical environment of the mosque design. So we need to have a lot of more open kind of a design, especially in the prayer hall. Like the concept of the dying mosque. So to allow this idea of cross ventilation. So but for the future design, I think it is very critical also that whenever we design a building like a mosque especially, we should not treat it as a house of worship, like an object value and object centered, but it must actually be harmony with the local context, including how to bring back this idea and the spirit of mosque actually as a center for culture of da'wah and community development, that actually can strengthen the fraternal ties between the Muslims and also the multiracial communities.
In your capacity as an academic, is this conversation happening? Have people started talking about, I guess, designing mosques in a more progressive way?
Yes, of course. That's why if you look in Malaysian context nowadays, we can see a lot of new modern mosque comes in without the usage of the dome, as the main structure, because there's no kind of I think the architects are actually try to look into a lot of what we know as functional kind of a design, and try to integrate between functionalism and also minimalist into a design of a mosque. So they try to avoid using this a lot of decorative embellishments, like what imitating the Middle Eastern kind of a architectural style. So they're more looking into the kind of a modernistic kind of an approach of architecture into mosque design. So I'm seeing this is actually something very positive, especially among the local designers in producing a best mosque design that actually gives awareness towards this idea of a community design concept. When you design a mosque, actually the most important thing is that try to propagate and promote the idea of the Islamic religion, not only to the Muslim but also to the non-Muslim also. And in one sense, trying to bring back this idea of ikram, what you call that, congregation, and also try to actually bring back this idea of what we call that communication between the Muslims and also the non-Muslim to happen in the mosque design.
You've been tuning in to I Love KL, and that was Ali Sabrina Ismail. She's the Director of Architecture from the Faculty of Built Environment and Surveying, University Technology Malaysia, and we've been talking about practical mosque architecture. That's all we have for this episode of I Love KL. If you miss any part of the show, you can check out the podcast at pfm.my/ilovekl, our app which you can find via Google Play and the App Store, and also Spotify. Don't forget to also follow the station on Twitter at BFM Radio. My name is Hanif Baharuddin, and you have been tuning in to I Love KL, bringing you closer to the people and places of our capital city. Join us again next week, only on BFM 89.9, the business station.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.